Now we begin, let me introduce a little bit for Professor Mahmood Mamdani. And he, of course, he is a great scholar, and now currently serves as still the Chancellor of Kampala International University, Uganda. He is the director of the Makari Institute of Social Research, the Herbert Lerman Professor of Government at the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, and the Professor of Anthropology, Political Science, and African Studies at Columbia. And he has published so many books. I just picked up some titles. Now, of course, today we will discuss neither settler nor native. These are book published last year. His early books, the When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism, and Genocide in Rwanda, and Define and Rule, and the Saviors and Survivors, and the Scholars in the Marketplace, and also the Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, that very famous book, When the Victims Become Killers, Citizen and Subject, as well as many of his early books like the NIMBIS of Population Control, the Family, Class, Caste in Indian Village, and so on and so forth, many of that. I should say Professor Mahmood Mamdani, I really admire that. He is not only a scholar, but a scholar with, to me, is a legendary experience. He was, he was the third generation of Uganda of Indian ancestry. So he had a very, it's a very special experience here. And he was educated early in Dar es Salaam and in Kampala and in America. I should say he received a scholarship along with 26 other Uganda students to study in the United States. And he was part of the 1963 group of Kennedy Airlift, a scholarship program that brought hundreds of Eastern Africans to universities in the United States and Canada between 1959 and 1963. So he was among the many students in the northern US who made the bus journey south to Birmingham, Alabama, organized by a student nonviolence coordinating committee to participate in civil rights movement. For these, he was chaired during the march and was allowed, to talk to the very famous story to the ambassador, Uganda ambassador, and a lot of the story. I just mentioned these. He studied. Eventually, he attained his Doctor of Philosophy in Government from Harvard University in 1974. So he, for a long time, he studied the colonialism, post-colonialism, nationalism, and a lot of the related the issues. I think that his work for us is very important because we are also discussing many issues from the East Asia and the Chinese perspective. So now I just give a brief introduction, and now the microphone is yours, Professor Mahmood Mamdani.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang Hui. I didn't realize you knew so much about me. As you even knew that I went to jail for one night. For one night, but I can't deny it. Yes, I did. I want to apologize to my audience and to you for being late and being even more late because I was sitting in the waiting room. But to begin with, I was late, which is probably why I was sitting in the waiting room. But I'm very happy to be in Tsinghua University, even though not in person, but at least communicating with students and faculty at Tsinghua University. I remember my last visit, and I remember saying that that one day I'll be back, hoping that one day I'll be back. I didn't realize I would be back in this fashion, but let's look forward to another day when a personal visit and a face-to-face meeting is possible. So over the next half hour, I am going to provide an overview of key arguments in Neither Settler Nor Native. This is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of the nation state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up in a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its borders, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Muslims and Jews. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was put forward in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities is the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation state. In this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. This development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. In this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and the domination of Africans, to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as two different modern ways of subjugation, each with a radical consequence. Second, I will ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of two different ways of defining political identity, one as historical and changeable, and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see identity as natural, and thus a permanent claim, is to see it as a timeless expression of a trans-historical innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest we decouple the nation in the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Native is today considered a more politically correct designation. But neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized accept the designation native. The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Indian, not the National Museum of the Native American. What would change if it was called the National Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? The two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, but the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the US. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, but it is a polity separate from the US. That's why Indians cannot be natives of the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty is another politically correct phrase, but in fact it masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of US Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany, after Nuremberg, also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state as part of a one-state solution, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The fact is that the Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but it survived politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease to the Nazi political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its borders, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals, but not citizens of the US. After 1921, Indians had to be naturalized as citizens. They had first to be purged as members of Indian polities, and only then become citizens of the US. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from Indians, Africans were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized. Africans were enslaved and dominated racially. The consequences have been radically different. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receding, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. We can see the big difference between the two in the US. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building, leading to a general emancipatory struggle over more than a century. In contrast, the two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. Politically, the American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by a traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to popular accountability. Finally, the obligation of the traditional authority was said to be to enforce a customary law on the homeland. The legitimacy of custom is that it too has been there from time immemorial. I will discuss the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons. One, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Two, that there can be a second and a third-class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging it of all minorities. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual rogue perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them, along with all those who survived: victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used under the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all who survived extreme violence. Excuse me. Let me turn to Israel. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three different groups. First, there were those who had never left the land. These were natives, Palestinians. Then there were those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. And finally, there were those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state, in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. The Zionist striving for a nation state cannot be understood unless we also grasp the lesson they drew from Germany. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. The Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined from Israel as a Jewish state, Jewish and democratic state, to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelled out the significance of the debate on one state versus two state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination, whereas a two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid to glimpse the vision of a third alternative. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 70s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when Black students, led by Biko, left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostel workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening, that white and Black are political identities, and that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're Black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC, which is Black consciousness, could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a Black nation of the Black majority, thus essentializing Blacks as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of Black as a historical political identity. The South African moment was born in the 70s and 80s. There was a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, it looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than just turning the world upside down or seeking to do so, it dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the Black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. The turning point was when anti-apartheid forces reformulated the demand from Black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to endow racial difference with political meaning. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland, citizenship and identity, forged under colonialism. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid. That was done through the creation of homelands, homeland authority, and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa regardless of race. It has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community. Instead of a rupture into two separate communities, one of victims of apartheid and another of perpetrators, blacks and whites, which would have required a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided. A minority asked for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community that did emerge in 1994 was that of survivors of apartheid. Not just victims who survived, but all survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. Apartheid power was not defeated. Neither did apartheid win. The situation in the mid-1990s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did apartheid power agree to negotiate in 1990? I think two considerations made captains of apartheid rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One was the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from the townships to Bantustans. But more important was the second possibility, one that signaled to them the possibility of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon the project of apartheid and looking for a different state project. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization, without which decolonization of society would be far more difficult. Now let me come to the real challenge, Israel-Palestine. I would like to begin with a note on political Zionism. At the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially recognized as a Jew. The most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions is, who is a Jew? If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer that question. And its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity? Are Jews members of a religious community or a nationality, or both? As a result, the state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by religious law, halacha, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. But there's more. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, white Jews who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers committed to bring other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews, who are today the majority in the Jewish population in Israel. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile toward one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, in fact, there's not one, but two political enemies. Not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. Let me close with a reflection on the Palestinian resistance. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With the return of the native after the Holocaust, the squatter must get out of the way and make room for the natives civilized by 500 years in the West. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the First and Second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all its citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinian refugees. The development of Palestinian consciousness straddling these groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home and from an all-or-nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon war was in fact a total war against the Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 days. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it, a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlement in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The Second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both intifadas responded to the failings of the official PLO. The second, in particular, reflected the frustration over PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed it. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, a political party known as the National Democratic Alliance, then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. In the months that followed, Bishara presented another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. This bill, he did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is, quote, a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, explicitly, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The internal engagement takes the form of an international boycott of the Israeli state entity under BDS. To the extent that BDS called for the de-Zionization of the state of Israel, there is reason to give it full support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to engage with it critically. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on, that of the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent or opposed to the Zionist state in the ongoing struggle to isolate its supporters. Finally, what can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, the apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle, which demanded reform of the political process to allow the oppressed the right to participate in the political process. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both. The internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society, so long as they did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Second, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed also leads to the isolation of the oppressors. So that it's not only the oppressed, but also some of those who were with the oppressors seek political change. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to all anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist groups, Jews and Palestinians. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this brilliant and rich talk and historical perspective, global historical perspective, touch upon so many urgent issues. And now we will invite the Professor Cui Zhiyuan to give his comments and questions.
Okay, Mahmood, it's really a great pleasure and honor to be your discussant. As you may remember, during your first visit to Tsinghua University, you kindly gave a lecture in my class for our school's international students. So you may be happy to know that ever since, every year after that, I use your books in my international students class. So my first comment is that it seems to me your new book is a further extension, but much more ambitious in your theoretical construction than your previous books. So for example, this book, maybe when victims became killers, and then you discussed a former victim, Hutu in Rwanda, became the killers. But in your new book, you, I mean, I can understand it simply, as a simple example is that Jews in the Germany was the victim, but in Israel, this former victim became kind of new killers. So it reminds me, it seems to be maybe a good analogy that your new work, in a way similar to this book, provincializing Europe, because right, the Europe should be provincialized according to this earlier famous book. But from your early works on basically African colonial and post-colonial history, then you enlarge your vision to the whole world, including American Indian, is really Palestinians and the failure of denationalization. And so the many connections are not so easy to be seen by, I mean, many people. But I think it's very nice and very important, very insightful that you, from the African history, now you kind of have a general theory to challenge the dominant Western theory of nation state. As you argue that this project of nation state started from 1492. And so I think in your talk, you gave a quite nice summary of the cases of American Indians, Palestinians, and denazification. And but you haven't emphasized or summarized your basic theoretical conclusions as you did in both in the preface and the conclusion of your new book. So maybe I just, if I understand you correctly, I just simply summarize your, for example, your main point of in the introduction is that this whole colonialism is based, the first phase of colonization is based on the civilizing effort, the civilizing effort. But this mainly leads to mainly the direct rule. So this is the first phase, the civilizing effort and the direct rule. But the second phase is especially after Indians 1857 munition, the rebellion of the Indian soldiers in the British Army. Then it came the second phase of colonialism, which is the indirect rule. And this indirect rule actually has been preserved after independence. I think that's the key, one of your key insights. That so after independence, these identities imputed or invented or fabricated by colonialists has been preserved by the new independent movement, the leaders. So, and so the real decolonization, in your view, requires decolonization of the mind, the decolonization and the depolitization of the racial identities. But then that's the, very briefly, maybe too simple summary of the first part in your introduction, but in your conclusion, I think you reach a very challenging, very broad conclusion that the real decolonization require the coupling of state from nation. So you require complete, you basically argue that we need a state of no nations. So it's a complete challenge to the nation state model. And we need, you argue we need a real new political imagination about a new political community, which goes beyond the nation state. Because you think nation state by definition must have a permanent majority and a permanent minority. And in this way, the nation state, almost by your definition, cannot be democratic. So I think I'm, so in your introduction part, I totally agree. But in your concluding part, I'm not disagreeing, but I think your conclusion may be too quick. In what sense? So I'm not saying your conclusion is wrong. Like the nation state is inherently, by definition, non-democratic. I'm not saying this is wrong, but I think this conclusion may be too quick. So maybe we need to consider some other theoretical and historical possibilities in criticizing and transcending the traditional nation-state model embodied by Western colonialism. So why I say that? Because as in your book, you mentioned that in the Palestinian case, Israel case, Edward Said's view is different from yours. So Edward Said want bi-nation state, but it's not a state without nation at all. But more generally, I think there's one possibility is what you argue is the state of no nations. But another possibility is state with multiple nations, as Edward Said's bi-state nation. But also in China, we are talking about multinational state. And actually quite interesting that the Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai used to use the American Indian example to justify Chinese multinational states. Because Zhou Enlai think if we in China just follow the American Indian model, then these American Indians will be put in an isolated territory. They will not have economic and cultural interactions with other peoples. So Zhou Enlai emphasized the Chinese notion, so-called national and territory autonomy. So it's not simply a national autonomy. So if he thinks if it was simply national autonomy, it would be similar to American Indian model. But in China, he argued that we should have a national plus regional autonomy. This regional autonomy means the national people has interactions with other people from other nations in the same territory. So here, I think that's why I think I think your argument, the nation state has to be non-democratic, is too quick. Is that because from Zhou Enlai's argument, I think Zhou Enlai's argument can be traced very similar to the so-called Austrian Marxist theory of nationality. As you may know, that there are two leading scholars of Austrian Marxist theorists of nationality. One is Karl Rahner, another is Otto Bauer. Karl Rahner became the president of Austria after 1945. But formerly, he was the professor of law at the University of Vienna. But Stalin wrote his famous Marxism and the Problem of Nationalities in Vienna in explicit debate with Karl Rahner and Otto Bauer in the 1913. And the main difference between Austrian Marxists and Stalin was that because Stalin, in his definition of nationality has to have 4 elements. One is the common economic life, common psychology, common language, but most importantly, common territory. So this common territory is similar to your homeland, like each tribe must have their own homeland, is by definition. But Austrian Marxists argue that in the definition of nation, we should exclude common land because they believe in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The population from different nations already had a mixed residence. So people already live together in a mixed residence. If you want to have a definition in the nation with common territory, common land, then it's almost logically will lead to ethnic cleansing, as you very solidly, nicely demonstrate in the post-independence. This ethnic cleansing become very bad in many post-independent countries. So what Austrian Marxists propose, Karl Rahner, because as a professor of law in the University of Vienna, he proposed the notion that each nation should become a legal person. In the sense, what he called a legal person is that what he called non-territory based cultural autonomy. So non-territory based cultural autonomy as a legal person. So even though they don't have to live together in the same common land, but by legal category, each nation can be a legal person, 法人 legal person. And then he go back to this kind of Roman voting method called curial voting. But in the more advanced, modern electoral method is called D'Hondt method. D'Hondt method is the mathematician from Belgium who first proposed it in the 19th century. So, but I'm not going to go to the detail of this method, but this so-called D'Hondt method, it basically is a more elaborated method of proportional representation, more elaborated than the Europe. But this, what even we just see as a proportional representation as a method of election, this already shows that this democracy is not by definition must have a permanent majority and a permanent minority. As a matter of fact, like in the 1994 South African first election, South African already used proportional representation. And in Northern Ireland, they use proportional representation with this D'Hondt electoral method. So I think this method has this advantage that on the one hand, they gave some recognition of this identity, even though this is a temporary, not to be decentralized, but this identity during a quite a long period of time does exist. So they show some respect of these current existing identities. But at the same time, through this proportional D'Hondt method, not to decentralize, not to fix this identity in the national election. And actually, in European Union, there are 16 countries in the whole European, 28 members. The 16 countries use the D'Hondt method because all these member European countries still have minorities. Cannot have a pure nation state model. So I think maybe what I'm trying to say is that I'm not arguing against your conclusion, but I think your conclusion may be too quick. Okay, so I think our discussion group must have better questions than me. That's all what I have to say. I want to thank you again for your really thought-provoking book. By the way, I say the last thing is that there are many antidotes in your footnote. It's really marvelous. For example, one example, recently in China, we translated a a book from US called Strangers in Their Own Land by Ali Russell Rothschild. But she actually was the wife of Adam Rothschild, which you cite his book on the Belgian colonialism, right? The King Leopold's Ghost. So this is so many rich. It's really a treat to read your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zhiyuan. And maybe we also collected some questions from our audience. They can send the questions to the organizer. And please. And before that, I would like to invite Professor Mamdani to make some response to Professor Cui's comments. It's fine.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful. I think it's a very productive exchange, both in terms of your understanding of what is theoretically new here, what is theoretically ambitious, from now extending the discussion of when victims become killers, from the Hutu in Rwanda to the survivors of the Holocaust in Germany, as they become really the drivers of the militias in Palestine and in the creation of a Jewish state. Then secondly, indirect rule, how the second phase of colonialism post-1857, indirect rule, continues after independence. And thirdly, the question of the decoupling of state and nation. And here you pose your most interesting questions and most fruitful questions, I would say. Now, first, let me say that beyond talking about decoupling of state and nation, I do not venture into this territory of providing a solution. I don't believe solutions can come out of the study of a professor. But at the same time, I don't believe that professors are useless. I think the raw material of possible futures, you're absolutely right, not one single future, but possible futures, is to be found in movements on the ground, whether social movements, political movements, is to be found in movements on the ground. The task of the intellectual, because movements on the ground are often, and I would in fact say always, contradictory. It's like a stream with currents crisscrossing one another. And the task of the intellectual is to identify these contradictory streams and to systematize an understanding, a theoretical understanding, a historical and theoretical understanding of these movements. And especially, and I agree with you completely, of roads not taken. We cannot just be wedded to what happened as if it was historically inevitable. Of course it has happened, but we must not discard roads not taken, but from that treat it as raw material from which to draw inspiration as we look to the future. Okay, so now your remarks. You see, I think that the question of the nation state was embraced by both liberals and Marxists. Marx and Engels, and not just Stalin, Marx and Engels talked of distinguish between historical and non-historical nations. Historical nations are those who have their own state. And non-historical nations are those who do not have their own state, but are destined to remain as minorities within a nation state, a state of another nation. Now, of course, neither the liberal theory nor the Marxist theory, again, as you point out, with Marxist theory, has remained stagnant. Each has had to come to terms with developing, with the ground moving under their theoretical feet, and therefore having to run to keep pace and to craft different, even conceptual frameworks in order to make sense of the new terrain. And I'll go into that. But before I do, I want to say one thing. The challenge for me is how to depoliticize culture. Because once culture is politicized, and by politicized, I mean the joining of culture and territory. That politicizes culture. And that was the creative response of colonialism to its own crisis. How to depoliticize it, how to delink culture and territory. And I translate that into delinking nation, culture, and territory, state. How to delink these two. I also think, and I didn't put this in the book, but I do think that this calls on me to rethink citizenship, because citizenship assumes, just like majority and minority, it assumes at the level of the individual, it divides those who live in the territory of the state. It distinguishes the citizen from the non-citizen, the citizen from the migrant. And my interest is in moving from citizens to resident. The ANC's 1955 charter said, South Africa belonged to all those who live in it. In 1994, the end of apartheid, in the first post-apartheid elections, the big question was, who can vote? And there were two answers. One, citizen, the other, resident. And the difference was huge because resident included all the migrant labor from outside South Africa, the labor from Mozambique, from Lesotho, from Malawi, from Zimbabwe, all these places. They were in the millions. And they had been the driving force, they with other migrants, internal migrants, had been the driving force behind the first trade union federation in the 1970s, FOSATU, but also present very strongly, COSATU. Now, these fought for the political enfranchisement of the migrant, not just the citizen. And they won. So every resident was allowed to vote in that election. But after that election, in the political dispensation, Inkatha Freedom Party got the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Gatsha Buthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs. And from 1994 onwards, Buthelezi's main agenda was to disenfranchise the migrant and highlight the citizen. And Inkatha Freedom's Party agenda was, ideological agenda was to tell the citizen that the migrant is actually living off your labor. The migrant should not have the rights the migrant has. So if you look at the xenophobic violence in South Africa, it does not target the racial stranger. It targets the tribal stranger. It targets peoples from across the border. not peoples from across the oceans. Okay, now let me go back to liberalism and Marxism and the attempts to come to terms with these challenges. And this is, I think, the most productive part of your question. And I find it fascinating. First, this notion of each nation should become a legal person. I would like to read this material before, because you rightly said some of the things I might have said hastily. So I'm going to take your advice and not comment on this, but say it seems very interesting, and I want to read it. But you see, the first attempt to rethink the nation state, or let's say to modify the notion of the nation state, is in America. I think it's in America with Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, because the settlers who came in from outside saw themselves as belonging to nations and wanted to create a kind of a multinational state, right? A multinational state. And this was the this was the program of the Confederacy, that citizenship should coincide not with being in, it should not be a US citizenship, it should be individual citizenship of all states. You become a citizen of a state, and by virtue of being a citizen of the state, you then become a US citizen. Came the Civil War. And Lincoln's contribution is his ability to see that America is not just a coming together of different nations. America has to be a political project that goes beyond this vision of multinational, different nations come together. So the amendments after the Civil War, now you become a citizen of the US, and by virtue of that, of the state. Actually, there's only one citizenship of the US. It means anyone born in California migrates to Alabama, and the day after has the same rights of anybody born in Alabama. So it's a citizenship based on residence, right? Except the Indian is not included, right? And that's the challenge they've never been able to face. They provided a permanent solution for the Indian. I would like to study the Chinese, and especially Zhou Enlai's explanation. I'd like to study it more. And I think proportional representation really does not remove majoritarian. What it does is it provides a formula for inclusion alongside a subsidiary to a majoritarian democracy. So it's not, to me, I would, but thank you so much. And now you owe me one, please send me the Zhou Enlai text so I can read it. And I know you sent me a note on the Austrian Marxists, but please feel free to add, don't subtract, keep on adding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we already got some questions, but first I would like to allow our young scholars at our institute, the reading group of your books, raise some questions first, and then I will continue to collect some questions for you. So what about the Naishi and others? Yeah, please.
Okay, great. Good morning, Professor Mamdani in your time, and good afternoon in Beijing time. So my name is Naishi. I'm currently the postdoctoral fellow in TIS, and in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we have been reading your book, and we have 5 questions in total regarding your book. So first of all, we all love it, and we have a lot of discussions and even debates. So now let me represent this group and raise these 5 questions to you. So, first, the first question is, as you mentioned, nation-state project and its homogenizing goals create the permanent majority and minority in Europe and the colonies overseas. While South Africa seems quite different, and South Africa rejects the political identity and embrace a shared survivor's identity, the identity of survivors. So in your opinion, is there any cultural roots or historical precedent for South Africa to realize these kind of decolonization of the political community? So what is the cultural roots or the historical roots of that? So this is our first question. Do you want to address one by one, or I?
No, just summarize some of our questions.
Okay, so my second question is, so the famous sociologist Michael Mann has its book, The Dark Side of Democracy. So in that book, he introduces many many policies carried out by Abraham Lincoln on kind of the massacre of these native Indians, and then the dark side of the forming process of one nation is concealed by current historical narratives. So now we have, of course, we all have a totally different image of Abraham Lincoln. From Michael Mann's perspective, then during these genocide or during these kind of ethnic cleansing, national and ethnic identity surpasses civil identity. So what is your comments on these kinds of relationships? I mean, between ethnic identity and civil identity. So our third question is, because this is a very hard question, I think. So in your book, you use like the terms like you propose this kind of relation between the native and the secular, and also we see a pool of political terms nowadays in popular media, in academia. So they are concepts such as native, indigenous people, the colonizer, the colonized, settlers, natives, and then we also see the phenomena of misusing them. So in terms of China, we see that now Western media are using the discourse of human rights to express their dissatisfaction on Chinese ethnic policies, to criticize the regional ethnic autonomy system of China. So what is your comments on how do we understand and criticize these phenomena? So the fourth question, it's a more, okay. It's a more open question. So about so actually it's for me. So I was really impressed by your discussion on the Nuremberg tribunals. Then I have an open question to see like how to use your model to understand another important tribunal, which is the Tokyo Tribunal. And what is your comments on the post-colonial situation on the Pan-East Asian area, especially in the Korean Peninsula? So our last question is a very interesting question. So we noticed that in the beginning of your book, you quoted Lu Xun from Lu Xun's famous story, The Hometown. And then we want to ask you why you use this quotation and what is the relation between these between Lu Xun's story and your book. Thank you.
So what I understood the first question to be is about nation state and permanent majorities and the South African sort of departure from this norm, and whether there is a historical precedent or any cultural root for it. I think that's what you want to know, whether there's any cultural root for it. Look, I was looking much more at the historical and the political. I did not, in my research, come across any significant cultural route for this development. When I was talking of the US pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, I should have added that the federation is a political innovation of settler colonial states. As settler colonial states sought to deal with internal differences amongst themselves, amongst the settlers, but at the same time confront the native and realize that the internal differences were based on the notion of each nation should have its own polity and territory. And that this would result in a project in which they were likely to lose. The challenge was to move away from it and to come to a new understanding of a different polity, the federal understanding. Now the South African, so the settlers in South Africa had a federal structure. Not only a federal structure, but even they don't have a capital in a sense, because the court is based in one city, the parliament in another city, the administration in another place. So and they try to move away from any kind of territorial concentration and a federal arrangement. The irony is this, that the settlers, and I think this was part of the negotiations at Kempton Park, which is, the settler worry was that now they would be the minority, confronted by a politically enfranchised Black majority. And the challenge was to move beyond that. And I think the move is very much a result, a response, a creative response to that political challenge. That's what I can say. I don't see any cultural route to it. The only thing, of course, is that if you look at pre-colonial polities in Africa, I've studied some, and I've not found a single case where culture and territory go together. Most of these polities were chiefdoms or kingdoms, and the king ruled everybody in the territory. The colonial ethic was segregationist. It segregated cultural groups. The dominant pre-colonial tendency in Africa was assimilationist, was very assimilationist. There was Swahili, the Zulu, the Hausa, the Amhara, all these people, if you study their history, they assimilate. They assimilate, sometimes aggressively, but not always. It's an assimilative. This present situation, the South African situation, where the homelands are still there, right? The homelands are still there. This present situation is a colonial heritage, okay, whereby each ethnic group has its territory. Now, I don't believe there's any place in the world without a minority. And I don't think that Edward Said's binational state, this is to go back to the earlier discussion, it doesn't depart. It's a modification of the nation state along lines of federalism. but it will not depart, because in a binational state, it is the national majority in each part which rules. Right? So the question majority minority just becomes located now in each part, unless you have an ethnic cleansing. And that was the UN's vision. The UN's vision was binational state, right? The Palestinian, the Arab state, as they called it, and the Jewish state. And in the Jewish state, the Jews were just a slim majority. So you started with a challenge. Second question, Abraham Lincoln. Sure, you have a different image. You have a fuller image of Abraham Lincoln now. You had swallowed, you had been spoon-fed some other image. So one of my objectives is to show you that the same great Lincoln, in a sense, who thinks beyond the confederal state, who thinks citizenship is not based on descent, but based on residence, right, is the same Lincoln who devises a permanent solution for Indians who survived the genocide. There were reservations before Lincoln, but Lincoln turned the reservation into a national institution throughout the US. Native settler, native indigenous. I personally think that, well, the right of self-determination of indigenous people is now sanctioned by the UN. And it's really nothing but an extension of liberal group right to natives whose lands were appropriated. Because the self in the indigenous self-determination, the self is the indigenous self. Well, I think we're back. We're back to the same thing. I mean, phase one was the colonized people who got self-determination, and that became national self-determination. And it became the creation of nation states now globally. And now the people who are left out of it, who still, because none of those are called natives. It's now groups inside it who locate their right to a particular piece of territory. They're called natives. And they have a right to a nation state or an autonomous territory. Now I deal with this question a little bit in the Indian chapter in terms of thinking of a way forward. But one last thing on it before I go to the last one. The liberalism, as is well known, is opposed to any group identity except one. That is the nation. Liberalism naturalizes the nation as a group identity. And that's cause for thinking. How is this central to liberal thought? Finally, the Tokyo Tribunal. I think the most interesting thing about the Tokyo Tribunal is because Tokyo Tribunal was supposed to be a version of Nuremberg in the East, but the justices could not agree. The justice who gave a dissenting judgment was Justice, I can't remember his name exactly, with Raganod, something like that, from India. The judge from India. And his testimony is worth reading. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I got some questions and I give you two. Now the first, how do you think the current foreign investment and migrant employees influences the consciousness of ethnicity, tribe, and nationalhood in Africa? Second, how do you think the national building process in Eastern Europe after the collapse of Soviet Union resonates with or differentiates from the one state road in South Africa that you have mentioned? These two questions.
Okay. Look, I'm not claiming to have written an encyclopedia, a global encyclopedia, right? Where every question there's an answer to every question. Neither am I claiming to be a politician who can be rightly asked to comment on any current development. So I do have a theoretical claim, but I have very limited illustrative material. So I declare my limitations by that statement. Sure, you're right that foreign investment, migrants is increasing the consciousness of ethnicity. Look, in some ways, if you ask why, you can look at these historical circumstances in which the apartheid project was born. Because in the early part of 20th century, right, there is massive migration from, well, there's a capitalist development, and capitalist development dispossesses peasants. It forces them to move in search of livelihood. And as they move, they begin to come together. And the ICU in the 1920s, the Commercial Workers Union in South Africa, the mine workers mobilization in the 1940s, etc. All of these were warning signals that these guys are all coming together. How do you, because the indirect rule project is fragmenting. How do you fragment? How do you undercut these mobilizations? And the work of, because the economic is mobilizing, is bringing them together. So it is the political which is dedicated to fragmenting them, right? And so the pushback, apartheid is a pushback from the cities back to the countryside, but based on ethnicity, each to its own homeland, to be governed by its own ethnic, tribal leadership under customary law. This is, so you have two things: capital, which is bringing your people together, moving them, internal migration, but now global migration. And then you have the state, which has to solve the question of how to govern this population. And the response of the state is to politicize the difference between the citizen and the migrant. Right? It does not just, it comes from below, but it comes from below in response to what's going on at the top. I said in South Africa, Gatsha Buthelezi and the Inkatha Freedom Party took the lead. Marx says in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, if you play fiddle at the top of the state, you should not be surprised that those down below dance. Eastern Europe, well, I mean, you know, Eastern Europe was set up at the time of Nuremberg by the Allies. The Allies ethnically cleansed Eastern Europe of Germans, right? Millions and millions of Germans. Right? I have the figures in the book. Transported in cattle cars, the same cattle cars that transported Jews, housed in concentration camps, the same in which the Jews were, right? And creating an ethnically cleansed, a series of ethnically cleansed states. Well, then the Germans were replaced by Russians. In the Federation, a movement of Russian immigrants into different parts of the Federation. But Russia had a policy encouraging immigration alongside a political vision of each nation must have its own state. Well, those could not coexist, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. But I must say, I don't know more about it. So I don't want to give you an answer. I just want to contribute to your question.
Thank you. I pick up two questions related to the South Africa issues. The first is the comment. The success of South Africa TRC is significant in that it's largely solved the possible post-apartheid racial conflicts. But it also paid a high cost. The wealth is still concentrated in the hand of white race. Racial conflicts simply shifted to the class struggle. In this sense, how can your concept of the survivor, which is equally applicable to the both rich whites and poor blacks, be justified? Is the survivor a political concept, or a moral, legal, or post-national identity concept? This is the first question. Second, I think you already answered actually in an early answer, but I still read it in Chinese. If one country, because if in one country, the majority, the population majority is overwhelming, it's much bigger. Then if you only give you the unitary citizenship, is the equal or the invisible discrimination? Is because he said that the population of white in South Africa was much lower, whether or not exception or sub. Basically, it's talking about the citizenship, or whether or not can be the basic the concept to find a solution for these. Well, these two questions here.
Okay. I do not think the TRC was a success. I have a critique of the TRC. The TRC reduced the violence of apartheid to the violence of agents of apartheid, to rogue individuals in the apartheid state. Like Nuremberg, TRC had no notion of the state as the perpetrator of violence. None, only agents of the state, who it then, like Nuremberg, held criminally accountable. With one difference, Nuremberg punished them, TRC did not. Now, crime, by definition, crime is against the state. The state cannot commit crime. So how do you understand? Because in both Nazi Germany and in apartheid South Africa, the prime mover of violence, of ethnic cleansing, was the state. And so I ask for a political understanding beyond a neoliberal understanding of crime limited to individual action. Second part of that question. Sure, the survivor, I mean, look, whatever the form of the political community, it is bound to include in it rich and poor. The project, the search for social justice is limited to political communities. There is a global search, but it's separate from, though related to. And I'm talking of political communities. And I'm saying, first of all, let's reform the political community. Let's get first things first. Let's reform the political community, because let's have an understanding of colonialism, not just as foreign control, but colonialism as having rethought the political community, having drawn new internal boundaries by politicizing culture, politicizing phenotypical difference. Right? And let's rethink those boundaries. That will not change the division, the class divisions. To address the class divisions is a project which will have an even chance. It will not have an even chance if you have internal divisions between races and ethnic groups. That project will fragment. So I'm just saying, first things first. Of course, the social situation in South Africa is terrible. Right? And today there's an increasing demand for social justice. And I'm saying that South Africans are better placed to deal with the question of social justice today, but not yet, because the ethnic boundary remains naturalized. They have to tackle this. If the majority is overwhelming, I'm not sure I got that second question.
He means that the percentage, because the proportion of if you, because citizenship is normally is a formally equal, but if you based on that find the citizenship as a solution in a country, if the majority overwhelmingly much bigger than the minority, the unitary concept of citizenship, whether or not could be invisibly discriminated.
Look, let's take an example. African Americans. African Americans are roughly 15% of the population in the US, right? They are a minority. They were a minority who were disenfranchised even after they were emancipated from slavery. We know that there was a legal slavery which followed. The number of people in jail subject to coarse labor, but compare the journey, their journey from the Civil War to today. Today, I would argue the African Americans, a minority, are the fulcrum for the mobilization for political reform and social justice in the US. Numbers don't explain it. What explains, unlike the American Indian, who was isolated, has been isolated in the reservations, the African American was part of a single state. And therefore, through thick and thin, through reversals and steps forward, compelled to build alliances. And if you look at that history, they're always divided between two solutions. One, we must have a state of our own, a nation state. So first was the Liberia. Just like the Jews, we must have a nation state. Jews, Israel, African Americans, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Didn't work. Then after that, they looked for, the solution was to find a nation state where the blacks are a majority, right? Somewhere in the South. The alternative proposal was Du Bois. We fight for equal rights, not a nation state. And the Du Bois option won out. Martin Luther King, Du Bois. So I think that, you see, your calculation of majority minority makes sense if you assume a nation state.
Mhm.
You have to break out of that vision of a nation state. Like China. Chinese people are a minority in many countries around the world. Okay, the Chinese and the Indians, after the end of slavery, became part of another kind of forced labor. And the theory of the nation state says, basically the assumption is each nation has its own state. And the fate of the minority depends on that minority having a state somewhere else, because each minority is a hostage. If you treat my people right when they are a minority in your country, I will treat your people right. Well, get rid of that vision and those assumptions. Thank you. I'm sorry to be so harsh, but
Okay.
you spoke to me. So
Yeah. Thank you. Now it's a follow-up, the question that it's immediately related to your question, the idea about nation state. The question is that how do Professor Mamdani see the paradox that COVID-19 brought to the idea of nation state? Paradox in a way that COVID-19 reveals one more time how globalized is the world by showing us how one virus can come from one region of the world and become a global issue within a few weeks. At the same time, the responses to the pandemic was mainly being held at the national level. No global strategy has appeared yet. How do you see the future of nation state in this context?
well, the rich ones are celebrating that they have the vaccine. The poor ones are hoping that the rich will share the vaccine. The only saving thing here is that for some reason, still being debated, the crisis is worse in the rich countries. The spread, infection rates of COVID-19, we have very little testing, but we do know that the number of people dying from COVID-19 is much less. Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, even in South Africa, which is supposed to have the most, it's really less than Europe, America, etc. So, I mean, sure, you're right. It compels us to think of the question globally. Not only this, but the question of terrorism was initially within borders, but then later across borders, which demanded that we think globally, that we think of antidotes globally. We think of antidotes not as criminal, but as political antidotes. Well, it hasn't happened. In fact, the antidote has been war. The Americans have decimated the Middle East, right? But now you are tempting me to go outside my territory as defined in the book. So I request you to let me stick to the ground that I addressed in the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We almost used up our time, but still, the one participant in our event from afar, he is a Palestinian scholar, I think. He wants to talk to you, that ask us whether or not we allow him to raise questions directly. Can you, I think maybe we can do that. It's fine, as a last question.
Sure, the protection of the chair is gone. I'm happy to be in a one-to-one contact.
Okay, okay. Okay, that's, I mean, allow him to directly
Yes.
address you. Okay, yeah.
So first of all, thank you for the talk and for allowing me to ask questions. Both Mamdani's talk is interesting, and I think the later discussions are also revealing about what I want to connect, a point that he made in the last minute, and then with the points that the commentator made, which I think a core question, whether should we think about fixing the structure of the state as it is, and we know that the problem of citizenship is very much connected to the problems of the state or the nation state in general. So it's very hard to disconnect them completely, or whether we should think of different structures, which was suggested in the comment, which also Mahmood talked about in the last response, which I also think very important to the question of culture that also Mahmood is interested in or concerned about, which I think we should also think maybe, or I want to hear what would Fanon think help us in rethinking culture while he was thinking about the post-colonial state, and the suggestions he had about creating a different structure, a different humanity, rather than fixing or imitating and trying to fix what's already present in the West. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also, like, just one remark about Palestine. I think, I don't know who gave you the background, and I think that's probably part of the problem, but the trajectory of politics is completely different from what you gave, or at least it has a lot of gaps. And one of the questions we always have, whether all the proposals we always hear, whether from the one you gave here or others who write, Edward Said and others before, whether all these proposals have not been thought before, and why do we ignore history when these ideas already were posted and addressed and talked about and attempted in the 20s, actually, to think of idea beyond the binational state, but thinking of a state for all its citizens. This is not a new thing. The Balad movement didn't create a new idea. The opposite is actually incorporated something from the pre-48, but that was a different political trajectory. So maybe another event will allow us to talk about Palestine. Thank you very much, Mahmood Mamdani.
Thank you very much. Well, fixing the structure of the state versus different structures. As I said earlier, I'm not trying to give a solution. I'm not trying to create a model. Even South Africa is not a model. I asked what is transportable here? Okay. What lessons can we draw from this? Not just from South Africa, but from the US, the one state, two state solutions in the US. What lessons can we draw from this? And you're absolutely right that there's not going to be one model. There never is. There will be different responses to common challenges. But amongst these different responses, we can still identify a thread that may bring them together. And what I'm saying is that in this case, the thread has to be decoupling the state and the nation, culture and polity. Okay. The question of Palestine. Again, you're right. All proposals have been made before. So there's nothing new, sure, about the proposal. But what is new is the changing context. Balad does not make a new proposal, but Balad is able to achieve a mobilization in a new context. BDS does not make a new proposal. BDS itself says that it's learning from the South African divestment movement. But BDS has managed to achieve what no previous initiative was able to do, which is to generate a constituency globally around the idea that there is something immoral about how the international community has provided cover, political cover, to the Zionist project in Israel. And what I'm saying is, neither BDS nor Balad have come up with new ideas, but they have shown the possibility of mobilization in the current context, and they need to learn from one another. So the onus is not on coming up with something new. The onus is to sift the old between what will work, what will not work, what is productive, what is not productive, and to build a mobilization behind it. That's the political challenge. It's not just an intellectual challenge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a really fascinating event for us. This is really great. I hope that we could create more chances to have this kind of the practice, let's say, the dialogues. So thank you so much for your talk.